Hey there, today we're talking about linting, and I don't mean the stuff you find in the dryer. We're talking about linting your code today on CloudDev Clarity.
Hey, Julie.
Hey there, how are you?
Well, I screwed up
We're getting better and better every time, better and better. Practice makes perfect. Hey, this is supposed to be loosey-goosey. It's informal. Nobody's going to care. Maybe they get to make fun of us. It's all good. We make mistakes too.
Well, I've proven that.
Yeah, well, right. Every day of my life I proved that.
Episode 5, check.
Yeah,
made a mistake.
Yeah, check. One mistake down.
All right, I have 5 check boxes. Anyway, all right,
yes,
so I got one check box
right.
filled.
Yes.
How are you today?
I am excellent. So linting, big topic, really timely topic.
Yeah. At least for us.
Let's talk about what it is. Yeah, at least for us. So let's talk, I think, a little bit about what linting is for people, right? Let's start there. I mean, linting in general is this idea of having rules about how your code is structured and how it's written and how it's formatted, and to try to drive consistency, right? And so the history of this, at least for the TypeScript people, I mean, there's linters for all sorts of different code bases, but for the TypeScript crowd, I suppose, which is maybe more of our target audience, maybe not. Anyway, there was TSLint back in 2019. They deprecated that in favor of ESLint, mainly, as I understand it, for performance reasons and to hopefully improve reliability and supportability. What's your take?
So, I mean, the history of linters actually goes way back. Right. So it's all back. It goes back to, I think, like the C days,
yes.
even before
C++.
And
I've used them there. Yep.
Yeah, and it was, I guess, the reason we had them. I always find it, when you understand the reasoning behind something, it's easier to understand why we have it and stuff. But so we originally were using these because the early compilers, when you would run your program through it, it just choke and be like, didn't work.
Yes.
But you had no context. So people created linters to look at your code, to do static analysis on it, to find issues before you ran it, to have a better chance of the compiler getting through it. And then you could, hopefully the app is then going to run and you can figure out, do you have logic errors or something?
Right, exactly.
And over time, the linters got smart, or the compilers got smarter, and they could tell you, error on this line or those kinds of things. And so linters turned into being more about being able to do static analysis of your code, and for to recommend good practices in order to enforce good practices in your code. And also, a lot of people use them, and a lot of companies use them to enforce like coding style guides.
Right.
So I found this list of like, what are some popular linters that are out there, and I was a little surprised by the size of the list. I've got Ansible, C++, CoffeeScript, CSS, Dart, Docker files, EPUB, Erlang, Go, GraphQL, Haskell, JavaScript, Markdown, NPM, Objective-C, Perl, PHP, Python, Ruby, Sass. That's one that I use that one too. TypeScript.
Yeah, CSS Comb was one that I used to use with Stefan. We don't actually, it's deprecated, so we don't use it anymore. But absolutely.
The thing with the TSLint and the ESLint one that I know is where you and I spend most of our time in the JavaScript TypeScript world. And that one was interesting because like we had one for TSLint, and when the TypeScript team decided that this doesn't make sense because the TypeScript team wasn't about creating a new language. They were about creating a superset of JavaScript and adding syntactic sugar. And so they decided, no, it doesn't really make sense. Instead, what we should do is we really should focus on making an ESLint linter. That's where our investment should be in terms of a linter for JavaScript or ECMAScript. Focus on that and have rules that are for TypeScript, but it all runs through through the ESLint tool.
Right.
And
yes.
And so the team that was doing TSLint, a company from, I think the company was named Planter.
Mm-hmm.
They saw the same thing and they're like, yeah, it makes sense. So instead of us working on our own tool, we're going to just jump over the TypeScript guys. And so they switched over to, and basically the whole world kind of said that the JavaScript world said, okay, ESLint is the tool that we should be using for doing linting. We shouldn't be doing TSLint in the context just of TypeScript. So this is not a replacement for everybody else, but it's just in the context of
right. They just essentially broadened the scope. And I think what then that helps with is if you use a particular framework version or whatever, there's a lot of times linting rules for that particular framework, which can then also help you, especially when you're talking about a corporate or a company-wide style guide, coding style guide. That can absolutely make some consistency.
Yeah. So what kinds of things are people going to see when they do this? Like when they, what kinds of rules do you see with the linter in TypeScript?
Well, so there's the things that are like definitely where you can get yourself into trouble. Like the things are allowed in both ways, but almost always you want to use one versus the other. And so there's the kind of like, are you sure you want to do this kind of rules? Equal, not equal is one of the ones that pops into my mind really quickly. Like the notorious equal means it's completely equal, where equal means it's sort of equal. Whereas equal is assignment, that kind of idea. And then there's stylistic things like I know in the PMP.js library, we have ESLinting rules, and some of them I might want to have some arguments with Patrick Rogers about some of them. Like every file has to have one empty line at the bottom. And I'm like, why are we doing that? I don't know why we're doing that.
That's a common one.
And it is a common one, but I don't understand the benefit of it. So maybe I just need to do some more Google research on that one. But I'm just like, it's annoying because I'll break the lint rule because I forgot to put a return at the end of my file.
It's and it's a fuzzy, like there's the rules today because the compilers are so much better than they were years ago. The rules today, like I think the line is very blurry on what is a rule that is debatable and opinionated versus what is a rule that is like good guidance. So like, for example, there are some rules that will say that you shouldn't ever do, if you're going to use promises, you should always have a catch on your promise. You shouldn't just do a promise and then have a then and just say, hey, I used the promise just to be able to do something asynchronously. It's like, no, you should always have a catch there to handle that other exception. And then there's the argument of, well, to satisfy the rule, that message that you're going to get or the hit on that is just create a catch and don't do anything in it. It's like, that's not really the point. But you can get away with it. There are other ones though and these are the ones that I like, to me, they get under my skin, is when the language supports something. So like in that case, right, the language support, I'm almost going to like refute what I just said. I'm actually going to refute what I just said, but this is the part where it's kind of like, what is the justice on the U.S. Supreme Court said years ago? It was like, what is pornography? It's like, I can't describe it, but I know it when I see it.
Yeah.
It's kind of like one of those things to me. Like it is when I look at the one that I just gave about, it's called no floating promises, where you don't have a catch. To me, that's a good rule, and the one that we should all pretty much abide by, because I mean, you should handle if you're going to do a try statement, you don't do a try statement to keep the compiler from breaking. You're doing a try statement, and you should finish it off with, the rule of what should happen in the exception. Yeah. But then you've got other ones where it's like, hey, I don't have to put, and TypeScript and JavaScript support the fact that if I don't put an accessor on a member, it's assumed to be public.
Right.
And then it's like, well, no, you should always put a public there because maybe it's not explicitly known. It's
that's
the language
characters I have to type.
Yeah, it's like that's more mental math that I got to do. Or the one that I feel is a great example is when you can have a parameter on like a parameter on on an argument.
Yes.
So like when I do a constructor, I can use constructor and then open paren. I can say private argument is a string. Yep. And that's all I have to do. And what that does internally is TypeScript says, oh, I'm going to create a private member called whatever the name of the argument is.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to take the parameter you're passing into the constructor. I'm going to assign it to the value of that private instance so we can look at it. And so to me, you saved yourself from writing 2 extra lines of code, but it's also really succinct and going, I know exactly what that's doing. I mean, it's but the message you get back from the linter is, not everybody may understand this, may be confusing for new people, so you shouldn't use this. And I'm like,
I call bullshit on that, because it just depends on the organization. Like, I can see if you are a very large organization that builds commercial software, let's say, as an example, and you have various levels of development expertise. You have new people right out of school, you have, very senior people, and, architect level, et cetera, and they're going to have different levels of knowledge about something. I could see that an organization like that making decisions that for some senior developers, they'd be like, oh, really? But because you potentially have this very large group of more junior developers, you want to keep things very consistent and very understandable. And so some of those rules, so the ability to create those rules makes a ton of sense. When you are one or two developers building software for some specific project or whatever, or internal project or something else, some of those rules are so ridiculous. I like consistency, don't get me wrong. I'm actually a little bit kind of OCD about my consistency. Like, I will go back, and I am of the mind that I like all my private probably because I wrote C# first. I like all my private variables to have the underscore. I actually like that. I'm one of the few, I get it, but I will go back and make sure they're all done that way. And it's because for me, when I'm quickly scanning code, I know, oh, hey, okay, this is that. And you know what I mean? Like, it just works with me, but I'm a coder of one, so I get to choose my own rules.
I don't know what you mean. Yeah, I don't know what you mean about OCD, but let me just fix this car. This is so we're good.
Yeah, we got that.
I'm right there. I'm right there with you. And I think so cards on the table. One of the reasons we're talking about this is because in the world that you and I live in, we talked about in all of our intros, is we live in the SharePoint framework world quite a bit. And the last week or two, they've released a new version where of the SharePoint framework, where they switched, or they went from on SharePoint framework 1.14 to 1.15, and in doing so, they finally dropped TSLint and they replaced it with ESLint. But when they did that, they took the advantage of saying, well, let's go through and let's add in a whole bunch of rules, and maybe they were already there as part of the argument. Maybe they were already there and they weren't working, which is another part of the argument they have. But the thing that I mean, for me, that kind of irritated me was that there's a lot of opinionated ones that they're enforcing on us about coding styles. Right. And I think this does open up a pretty good debate that you could have in finding out where people, like, what side of the aisle you fall on. Whereas what is their role in that sense of coming up with those rules? So I'm curious to know that to me, there's 2 or 3 different swim lanes you can fall into, or different buckets you can fall into at this. One of them is, in the case of the SharePoint framework, they've gone through and they've built a tool where that creates new projects just for the SharePoint framework. So it'd be like getting Visual Studio or getting like VS Code, but it's something that's creating brand new. You're only using it for this one target environment or target framework. And they're defining a bunch of rules. Another scenario is using ESLint and linting rules for like a company project. A good example is what you're doing with PMP.js. Mm-hmm. I wonder, I've got my opinion on it, but I thought I'd, ladies first, I'd let you go through, unless you want me to say something so you can refute everything I say.
Well, I might do that anyway. No.
Well, no, that's fine. I am a big boy, but I cry afterwards. I just have to make it for another 20 minutes and I cry later. But I think that I'd be curious to know, like, where you fall on the whole. What do you think? Where would you use it? Where would you not use it? Like, just first question, then ask you and put you on the spot. Do you like linting in your projects or not? Generally.
Yes, very minorly. Like, because I have a set of consistent things that I like to do, linting can help me just make sure that I've met my own criteria, right? Mm-hmm. That I've made my code as clean as I want to make by enforcing the rules that I like. but I'm also
Right.
a developer of one, right? So it's going to be the things that the stylistic things and the things that I maybe notice that I make mistakes on, that I would like to just make sure I have a little extra set of, rules sitting there underneath. That's just going to keep me honest, keep everything clean. If I'm getting lazy, if it's the end of the day,
It's
if
like
I've
creating,
got
like creating the employee handbook when you're a company of one.
Right. It's yeah.
These are the rules
I'm
we're going to abide
hesitating
by.
because when Mark Anderson and I first started working together, he sent me the a joke employee onboarding email letter. So I'm flashing back to that where he's like, HR would like to tell you, it's just him and I, but he sends me this like onboarding letter on my first day. I was like, you dork. God, I love you. But yeah, so it's just a set of like, a little bit of rules. Now, if like say Sympraxis, which from a development perspective is Mark a little bit, but Derek and I, like early on when Derek was writing more code with me, I would have loved to enforce the try catch rule so that he couldn't write a method without try catch in it, because I was just being bitchy about it, like reviewing his code going, I'm seeing 35 methods that have no try catch in there. Please go back and fix that. Okay, thank you. But so from a stylistic point of view, I could see a group of developers coming together and saying, hey, again, similar to me wanting to have my own little guardrails on certain things, great. What I don't like, what I'm really against, is if it just doesn't matter. So like type assignments, for instance, whether you do as type or type, with the brackets around it before the type, before the variable, what the frick difference does it make? It just doesn't make any difference. The transpiler likes both of them. I don't understand why anyone needs to say, you must do it this way or that way. Sometimes it's about code readability. If you've got a fairly long line, having to do the as whatever with spaces in between it, that readability is really tough. Whereas if you have the brackets, it just pops out at you like, oh, we're doing type reassignment here, and it pops. So I actually kind of lean towards that method, but I've done it both ways because maybe I'm at the end of like an object that I'm creating, and now it makes much more sense to put as the type sort of at the bottom of the line, just because stylistically it's easier to read. And I'm going to maybe switch back and forth between those two methods, depending on what... Surrey just answered me. That's what that jump was about. Surrey's like, what? What do you want?
Okay. Between my Apple Watch doing the same thing, and I've got a Alexa on my desk right now. Whenever I say something, I don't want her talking to me right now. So
yes, I should have muted. I will note. So now I have a check mark. Mistakes made in version 5.
Man, you could hear like when CJ and I were doing our podcast, there was always, every once in a while, you'd hear Amazon Alexa would just chime in like, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Like, shut up.
It startled the heck out of me. It's never happened. Anyway, so that's sort of my viewpoint on it. Like rules that stylistically keep you consistent because there's a point in being consistent, or because you want to maintain some consistency, and or things like the equal not equal one I take out because I do a lot of testing like object equal null, which means is either null or undefined, and I don't really care which, and I do that quite a bit. And is it technically right? It's fine. It works. It's and I don't want to have to go and put a lint rule in every single time I do that. I'm careful enough with my triple equals that I feel comfortable not having that rule. But I could see if I had a bunch of junior developers, I would maybe want to be like, maybe you need to very explicitly say you're going to do this.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, and I think the other thing too, the type declaration one or the type definition one, I thought that's a really good one, because I could be in the exact same file or in the exact same method, and I could use it both ways. Like the argument that they say is that if you're in a React project, you shouldn't use the one where you use the angle brackets at the beginning of the object, because that's
it's JSX or TSX,
that's JSX,
depending on
JSX or TSX.
And if you're doing a web component, you theoretically could be type asserting something that's a web component. So that's legit. Yeah.
And so I see that being a confusion, but then I also see, like, if I'm in the middle of a method and I'm trying to pass in a number as a string or vice versa, or a Boolean as a string, and I want to say like variable as string, I don't want to do like bracket Boolean. One of them is like what you're saying. When I look at the code, your code should be, I'm not pulling the card out that, I don't need to document my code. My code documents itself. It's clear on what it actually does. But there's a bit of that, right? That I don't feel like I don't need to have a certain number of comments in my code. If I look at it, I can understand. I'm like, I'm good. Like, I was looking at one of my students, he was having trouble with something and he shared a method. It was only 4 lines. And I'm looking at it and I'm just staring at like, what the hell are you trying to do here? And I couldn't figure out what he was trying to do because the code was written in a way. There's another reason why I say that, but why it was confusing. But I'm looking at it like you should write it in a way that's actually pretty intuitive to someone. Yep. So to me, the thing where it falls down, the thing, my line in the sand of where things go is that I look at it as 3 different things. So I look at it like in your case. So let's use it if you're like a corporate developer or you have a team that's working on a project.
Right.
I think rules and if you have multiple people working on a project, I think rules going as far as you want to go is perfectly fine. Yeah. So like, for example, PMP.js, there are 2 of you that are working on that project, and it's an open source
community, right? Community contributors too, which is probably the more important reason.
Exactly. And it's an open source project. And so that open source project, you want the rules that the PRs that people submit, you want them to follow the same convention that you follow, because you don't want to sit there. We do the same thing in the docs for the SharePoint developer docs that I help maintain. 100%.
Yeah.
They've got they've got markdown rules, Linter, that they use, and say you make sure you do this, don't do this, don't put multiple break lines in here, multiple empty lines in this whole thing. I get it. I understand you want things to be consistent, but that is keeping consistency within the project. The one that I really don't like is when a vendor, like what the SharePoint Framework team did, when they start going in and putting in rules, and from their own words, they said, if we think that we can do something to improve or promote better coding practices, then we think that we should do it. Like, hold on a second now. I get that there's some that you want to put in there, and some of them not very debatable, not very in terms of like everyone's going to agree on this, or 8 out of 10 people are going to agree on it. So I'll let that one go. But when you start telling me on how I should be developing my projects, I may work for a large Fortune 500, Fortune 100 company, and we have our own coding styles. Who's to say that our coding styles match what yours are? Who's to say that I'm a Fortune 500, that we're a bunch of developers, that we aren't, like, IT or development is not a core discipline at our organization? We're not a tech company. We sell sod. Right. And we have a little app that we wrote to do this. I don't feel like my rules, my coding styles are going to be different than if I worked at Google or Microsoft or Netflix. And I don't think that a company like Microsoft, as a vendor, should be imposing those rules on my projects, because now, as a developer, so this is firsthand, I'm using myself as an example, as somebody who writes TypeScript for everything. I use it for server side, I use it for client side, I use it for SharePoint Framework projects, I use it for React projects that aren't SharePoint Framework, I use it for Teams projects that aren't SharePoint Framework. I have a style that I like to follow, and when it's only my stuff, that I'm going to follow for all of my stuff. But now, when I create a new SharePoint Framework project, someone in Microsoft who doesn't write production code, or who doesn't write like client-facing code, and they just write a tool to help me to write projects, they now have come up, someone arbitrarily decided that I should have the word public in front of all my constructors. I'm like, that's not necessary. Or now I can no longer use the private accessor on an argument in a constructor declaration. I'm like, this is ridiculous. This is not, I think that, to me, that's overbearing, and that's them overstepping their bounds. And frankly, if you want to go to the logical, like, to the real thing, I got, like, when they say, like, oh, if we could be doing something better to make our code better, then we feel like we should do that. I'm like, oh, well, then let's make sure that everyone has full testing and you have code coverage being 100% on all of your projects. Is that too far?
I would say yes, but that's a different show.
But
yeah,
I guess my point is, who's is that their responsibility? And in my argument is no, it's not their responsibility to define those rules. As the vendor giving me a tool to build new projects.
Right. As a framework provider, in this case, as them playing the role of a framework provider where they expect organizations and individuals that cross the world as far as, what their roles are, what their, organizations are structured like, whether they're selling a product, creating an internal product, messing around because it's their Saturday hobby, whatever that is, to provide a set of rules and say everybody has to abide by these rules. I agree that I don't want that enforced on me. I want that to be maybe a side thing, an optional thing. But I think the thing that, even if it's forced on you, right? Like, even if you don't have an option when structuring your project, then I, at the very, very, very least, want all of those rules to be at the top level. I think the thing that I dislike about the implementation most is that they're extending rule sets that exist in other projects. So you end up with 2, 3, or 4, depending on what project framework you pick, you end up with 3 or 4 dependencies on other projects that have lint rules defined in it. That's just a JSON string of key value pairs, essentially. I want that up at that top level. Like, if you're going to create me the ESLint file for my configuration, then put every single one of the rules that you want to define in that file, so that I can very quickly see what all the rules are, make decisions. I think that's a good educational thing. Like, if the point is that we're trying to develop people with better coding practices, then bring it front and center. Don't hide it. Don't hide it behind buried node modules that you're bringing into your project. And that's the part that kind of gets me the most. So I agree with you. I'd rather maybe say, hey, I'm going to have my own set of rules, but now I'm doing this either deleting those, I'm deleting a bunch of dependencies and then restructuring the file. That's like a lot more steps that I got to go to get my own, version of the rules, versus if you say no dependencies because you don't need any, and you're just going to, in the project structure, define an ESLint config file with all of the rules spelled out that you are enforcing, and make it super quick for people to go override that, copy paste, or replace the file entirely with one that you've got centrally located, or, or just have maybe you have a corporate dependency that you're supposed to take that includes those files. Like, why not that? You know what I'm saying?
Yes, that's the one. And that's the part that I guess that I think that's what irritates me about it, is I feel like in this case here, that it's a great example of someone not really understanding how this works in the real world, and how companies, developers, organizations, product of ISVs, and just consumers of the project, how this stuff is supposed to work. I gave example to somebody, and I thought that this really sums up like my 2 cents on the whole thing, is that so when you have unit testing or automated testing, you can have something in there that does code coverage, and if it will check things like functions, branches, statements, all that kind of stuff, and make sure that your code coverage is on a scale of 1 to 100 in terms of a percentage of how much of your code is actually covered by automated tests. And you can set a rule in your testing to say that if your code coverage falls below these thresholds, then that's considered a red build. Someone broke the build. Even if it works, it's still a red build because you haven't put as much stuff in there.
Yeah.
So from Microsoft's point of view, do they want to go through and put testing inside of a default project? Cool. But they should not be putting any code coverage rules or any kind of numbers inside of it. Maybe they can comment that section out, but they should put nothing in there. When it comes to like a utility that I have that updates a project to add that kind of testing in it, I deliberately do not put in the code coverage rules in there. I put in code coverage stuff in there to give you stats, but I don't specify what the thresholds are for a green or a red build.
Right.
But if I was running a project like PnP.js, I would have something like that in there, code coverage in there, because I want to make sure that someone is not submitting a big PR and is putting no tests in there, and they've dropped the level of our coverage down, because that means they're submitting code that is not covered compared to the rest of it by tests, which if we set that as a rule, then we should enforce that. And so that's the part to me, like I think that those things kind of show that you can do it, but you can do it in a way that doesn't feel like it's a big deal, that's going to feel so overbearing. These poor souls that go to use the SharePoint framework and upgrade their project from 1.14 to 1.15, and now they're met with, literally, I heard this today, one guy's got 555 warnings, another guy's got 20 some odd errors and 970 warnings, and they look at it and go, is this a big deal? I'm like, does it still work? And like, yeah, it still works. I'm like, then you can turn off ESLint if you want and just keep going on with your project. Is that a good idea? I'm like, that's up to you.
But it's very intimidating. I think that's the problem. Like as a first run experience, like, so for you and a me that's used to using this stuff, you know, we like see that stuff and be like, Jesus, all right, fine. Let me go figure out which ones to shut down. And, you know, you can work your way through it. I think for other people, they see that and they're like, I don't even know where to start. And I'm just going back to where I was, you know, and I think that ends up being a little too intimidating is what I would fear, you know.
I could not agree more. And I'd be curious. You know, look, so we talked a little bit about the SharePoint framework stuff. And I think that if you are a SharePoint framework developer, there's a few resources that we do want to provide you. I've posted a couple things. I'll post a couple things in the description for it. I did a blog post and a video about it. So if you want to see like what's the experience like and how do you go through and address the fixes in your project for the common things that would show up, I gave you my 2 cents on that. It's an opinion.
That's a great resource. Yeah, but it's a great resource to just get started. If this is happening to you, try one of the resources that are going to be there.
Yes, that'll be down. Yeah, the notes below. And then the other one is that Microsoft has said that they're interested in feedback on this. Now they've made this change. And there is a discussion item on their issue list for the SharePoint framework.
Yeah, we'll include that in the show notes.
That people can go jump in and give them their 2 cents on it. So if you want to have an impact on the decisions they've made or decisions they make going forward, you got to give them.
You got to be vocal, right? Yeah. It's like, you know, if you don't give your representatives the feedback, you don't get the government you want. Well, it's the same thing here. So
got to vote.
Got to vote.
That's as far as political we're going to go.
Yeah, we're done. That's it.
So, hey, I know, you know, Julie, this is is there anything else that you wanted to say on this? Or
no, I think we really hit all the highlights. So,
well, one thing I do want to say is that, I mean, this is the last episode of like a batch dump that we're doing with all of these episodes. So if you get to this point, you have probably seen that we released 5 episodes all at once. Remember, we did say that we're going to do about 1 a month or so. At least that's the cadence we're going to start with. So if you look at this going, man, there's like 5 of them. They just announced this. They got 5 right there. I mean, I can't wait till the next episode. Like, hold your horses. We didn't want to just release like 1 episode and have you wait for 30 days for stuff. So we wanted to give you
ridiculous.
Yeah, we wanted to do show intro. So what is the show? And introducing me, so people could know who we were. Yep. And then 2 meat and potato episodes. Last episode 4 was all about REST and the SDKs. And episode 5, this one is all about linting. We will be coming back. We will be doing more episodes, but again, we just wanted to set the expectations on where things would be and where we're going.
And please provide feedback if you have ideas for things you'd like us to cover. Certainly put them in the comments of this episode or any of the episodes, and we will be sure to see it.
Absolutely. So, and with that, I want to say, hey, what did you think about the episode? Right. So let us know by dropping a comment below or submit a topic to discuss on future CloudDev Clarity episodes. And if you like this video, you like this episode, please give us a thumbs up and smash that big red subscribe button below the video so that we'll see, or you'll see when we publish new videos and new episodes on Microsoft 365 and Microsoft Azure and related topics for developers. Thanks a lot. We'll see you in the next video.